How's it going, everyone? In this video, I'm going to be talking about mental health and medication. Like I mentioned in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about mental health and medication and a couple of ideas or thoughts for just kind of working through the association between these two things. So, the first thing that I want to touch on is the stigma that's often associated with taking some sort of medication to help deal with a mental illness. I think this is something that is fairly common both for people who don't have any form of mental illness or haven't really experienced it, as well as those who have occasionally experienced it and those who have constantly experienced it. There's some sort of idea floating around out there that we should be able to kind of deal with our issues not using any kinds of medication. And this is a really interesting relationship and one that can be very negative and stop people from getting the sort of help that they need. I personally, even though I'm very immersed in this space for a very long time, had some of this mindset of just like, I don't know, I think I can just figure it out. I don't need to use medication. And the thing that this misses, the problem that arises when this happens, is not recognizing that all people are wired differently. So sometimes some of the symptoms that you experience for, say, depression or anxiety, for example, that's mostly what I'm going to focus on because it's what I have the most experience with, some of those can be related to lifestyle. But on the other side of things, you can also have some of these concerns or some of these problems because of the way that your brain is wired. And you may or may not be completely related to how you're living your life. You may be doing all kinds of things correctly, but have some sort of wiring or some sort of chemical imbalance that's not allowing you to fully optimize your happiness and well being. Now, it seems like some people don't really believe that this is actually true or that this is the way it works, and that if, you're feeling symptoms of depression like really low energy, low mood, this is somehow some sort of character weakness. What it doesn't take into account is this part that can be genetic. And, if you relate it to some other sort of more physical or more well accepted type of disability, like you think about maybe the propensity to get diabetes, right? There is some subset of the population that is wired in such a way that it is extremely easy for them to get diabetes or to get arthritis or to get some other form of like physical, really well accepted disease, regardless of the actions they take, right? Again, there might be some things that you can do to kind of prevent it or slow it or tune it down, but basically you can get unlucky in such a way that you basically have to deal with these sort of symptoms regardless of how you choose to live your life. And mental health problems can arise in much the same way. So as we're talking about some of these other things, like yes, your behaviors do have an impact and they can moderate what happens a bit, but your genetic baseline also does determine part of the range. So for some people, they are able to make different choices and largely eliminate a lot of the problems they're facing. But some people are wired in such a way that regardless of the choices they make, they may not have a huge influence on some of the mental health concerns that they're facing. So it really depends on who you are and what you're facing. Now, the other thing that I kind of wanted to parse out while talking about the stigma is I believe that sometimes some people think that there's this idea that people look at medication as their only way to make their life better, right? It's kind of this idea of like, oh, you take this medication and then suddenly your life is perfect and it's like these happy pills type of thing. And that's not really how it works, right? In the same way with some of this stuff about other diseases, like you need to kind of work at it from all different angles and use everything that's in your favor to help you out. So if you're not making good choices, even if your baseline is good for mental health, right? Or if you're in a bad environment or, there are things that can happen or things that you can choose that can deteriorate your mental health even at a strong baseline. So again, it's a combination of the two things. And I would never say, oh, you should just take the medication and give up on doing anything else that works for your mental health. But it is something that you should consider as you look at the options, as you look at the outcomes, right? Again, for me personally, I spent a lot of time in the cognitive realm really working down some of these different pathways until I personally found that like I was at an impasse that needed some help. And now that I have had some experience with medication, which I haven't had in the past, I'm realizing that there are ways that you can help yourself by exploring some of these options. And it has nothing to do with your character or who you are as a person. I think that, like I have way more tools around this like mental health and well-being stuff than most people do because I enjoy learning about it and I've spent a lot of time in the realm kind of learning about different tactics and techniques and whatnot. And I still think that like I was able to make quite a bit of progress, but for me personally, like this medication route has helped a lot, and it's knocked out some of the things I've never been able to work away from with just these other strategies. So I kind of wanted to share that experience just to let people know that it may not always be solvable by simply making different choices, right? And in the same way, again, like with certain different types of illnesses, you may not just be able to eat better to solve certain things. You might have to also explore taking some sorts of medication. So now let's move into some of the other reasons that people are a little bit skeptical about medication or why they don't really want to try it. So one really common train of thought about mental health and medication is not wanting to become reliant on a particular medication to live your life. And this is a position that I held as well for a very long time, and it's a really interesting position because I would do things, and I know many other people who are in this position do the same thing, but I would do things that I would consider self-medicating, and like drink a lot. Like I used to drink a lot to try to get rid of these feelings, and it's a really a strong piece of hypocrisy, right? Because what would happen is I would not feel great. I would have some sort of problem with my mental health, and I would turn to alcohol to try to change my mood and try to retarget it and make myself feel better. Now, what's weird about that is, I had this mindset of like, well, I don't want to use medication because I don't want it to be addicted to it. I don't want to have to use it. I don't want it to change my brain. But I was doing the exact same thing with a substance that isn't built for that type of use. So basically, I was using a tool that wasn't very effective for trying to solve some of these problems. And I think this is a very common case. I think a lot of people who have some mental health problems look to other substances to try to self-medicate and get through it. But these aren't designed to help with that. And, there are some problems with like mental health medications. They're all not 100% perfect, but they are typically more effective than other sorts of substances that you're going to find. The other part of that that's interesting is a lot of this stuff makes depression or anxiety or other mental health problems worse. So what it does is helps in the short term and makes things worse in the long term, and it makes it really hard to recover. So once I realized that I was self-medicating in a way or using substances that aren't for treating the problems I was having, and I realized that I was being kind of a hypocrite, I was much more open to that pathway. And I kind of wanted to share that idea because I think it may resonate with a lot of people who do sort of the same thing, right? They use substances that aren't necessarily designed for improving mental health to improve mental health because they don't want to be addicted to some other substance or have to rely on some other substance for their well-being, even though that's effectively what they're doing. And some people may not, do other things like drink to change their well-being. They may not use any like mind-altering substances, but many of the people in this position are doing things like using overeating as a way to kind of emotionally self-soothe. They're using, are at the extreme end of things. People are using self-harm or other ways of basically trying to change your emotional state that aren't really designed for these types of problems. So if you look at it from that approach, medication is a much better option in a lot of circumstances. In a lot of the times that, when we're using these other methods to try to change the state, it's not necessarily going to work and it can make it worse in the long term. Another piece of the medication use that people get worried about is the timeline, and they don't want to, be forever on this drug. And that's maybe why some of these other strategies come into play, like, oh, I can just drink when I want to, or I can just have treats when I want to, or whatever. It feels more controlled. Some medications can, be used for a long period of time, and some are on a shorter period. But it's really interesting because, if you don't want to rely on those things for your well-being, you also shouldn't want to rely on anything else, right? Like, there are always going to be things that you use to increase your well-being. And if you happen to be wired in a certain way where changing the chemical balance helps you have a much better and more fulfilled life, then it's going to be useful and worthwhile. It's kind of like saying, if you broke a bone really badly, like, oh, well, I don't want to have surgery that mends those bones forever because it's not natural or normal or whatever else, right? Like, we should use the tools at our disposal. We should use the things that exist to try to give us an optimal, good life. Or another good example is like contacts or glasses, right? Like, in the same way, you can be born with kind of not great vision, and then you need something for a long period of time, maybe forever, that helps correct your vision. People don't seem to have as much problem with that. And it's interesting to me because these parallels are all the same, right? It's all a matter of what kind of composition you happen to be born with. Now, people have a little bit more in their head about these things because it's more directly related to your thought processes and patterns. But in the end, it's all about your genetic wiring. And largely, these things can be out of your control. Again, it kind of depends on your wiring. Behaviors do have an influence, but there can be situations where basically how you're wired determines a lot of it. The last point I wanted to address about taking medication is some people get on medication and then they feel like a shell of themselves. They don't quite feel right. They just feel a little bit different or distant. I personally have not had that experience, so it's going to be a little bit tougher for me to speak to, but I do know that it's kind of a process of exploration for a lot of people, right? A lot of people kind of have to try a few different things, different doses, different time periods. So I would look at it like any other sort of well-being project, right? And I think I've talked about this before, but like I had a gratitude journal, for example, where I was writing things down and it did not work for me. And I did it for a long time. But when I switched to doing kind of a few minutes of grateful reflection, that has worked wonders. So it's kind of the same thing where like this particular drug may not work, this one may not work, but as you go through this process and kind of figure out what one actually makes you feel good and fulfilled, that's going to pay benefits long term. So it's definitely something worth exploring, especially if these are the types of things that are causing major inhibitions in the rest of your life. So all in all, I just kind of wanted to talk about a couple points regarding mental health and medication. I know there's a lot of stigma around it. I know a lot of people are really skeptical about jumping into this. But I think for the most part, it's a pathway worth considering. And it's really something that, if you're having some sort of problems, anxiety, depression in that realm, it's worth kind of talking to somebody. It's worth starting the conversation because even if you find that medication isn't the right path for you, it is one of the options. And when it comes to our happiness and well-being, I really truly believe that we should explore everything at our disposal and kind of act at every level that we can. So I just wanted to, in whatever way I could, share a little bit of my experience, help dispel some of that stigma so that for people, that medication will be really useful. You can feel a little bit more confident exploring that option and seeing where it takes you. Because, again, for me, I spent many, many years dealing with some symptoms that I don't know if I necessarily needed to now that I'm on the other side of it. And it took me getting to a really bad place, basically having like a complete breakdown to even be open to this possibility. And if I can help anyone short circuit that pathway by just a little bit, I think it's worthwhile. So, as always, I like to include a couple reflection questions for this video. They are the following. 1. How do you think about mental health and medication? 2. Have you ever used other substances to help improve your mental health? How did that work in the long term? That's all I've got for this video. Hopefully that gives you a couple, new ideas on how to think about mental health and medication. As always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, throw them down in the box below and I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I will see you next time.
You can check out more content at howtohappy.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date on the videos. We've also got a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook that you can check out. Reflect, take action, and enjoy life. See you next time.